And so the reason I was introduced to this book by Plymouth members a year ago, maybe. Thank you, Tony and Heather. And I was immediately captured by it. I am not from Minnesota. I did not grow up here. I have only lived in Minneapolis twice, but 2 different times. But I have begun to make this my home. And what I found missing was a certain amount of understanding of what this place was. When I lived in Chicago, everybody talked about the ethos of Chicago, and it was many different things, but it was part of the conversation. And I wasn't finding that in Minneapolis. So this book was a great gift to understand the rootedness of this place that I was investing in. I was also struck by this, and I'm going to read just a little bit. In the prologue, this is the whiplash of Minneapolis's story. Each month brings a bevy of accolades, lauding Minneapolis as one of the nation's greenest, healthiest, most literate, LGBTQIA plus friendly, bike friendly, dog friendly cities. We have the best parks and the best music, food, and beer scenes. It's one of the best places to live, a well-kept secret, really. And have you seen our awesome airport? The same month also brings the latest evidence of how unaffordable the city's housing is, how unwelcoming it can be to newcomers, and how crippling the disparities are when you measure these things by race. Minneapolis is home to some of the largest, sometimes the largest gaps between how healthy or academically successful white people are compared to Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. A lower percentage of African Americans own homes in the Twin Cities than in any metro area in the country. And I read that mostly for the concept of the whiplash, which I found to be fascinating and really engaging throughout the entire book. So there will be a class offered on this book if you want to dive deeper in April and May. I will be leading it with our friend Jim Bear Jacobs, and then Tom will join us on the last day for more in-depth conversation. And now that's enough for me. Tom, please introduce yourself and get us started.
Well, thank you, Seth. And thank you to everyone on the staff of Plymouth Congregational who coordinated this event. Also, apparently, thank you to Tony and Heather. So I really appreciate you as well. And I don't know if I've met you before, but if not, I hope I can meet you at some point in the future when it's safe. My name is Tom Weber. I used to be a reporter and a host for NPR News. And I left in 2018, and midway through 2018, and I actually spent most of 2019 writing this book. This was my big project. I actually grew up in the Chicago suburbs, so hearing Seth talk about Chicago there was interesting as well. And I moved here, what was it, almost 13 years ago now. So I'm firmly, well, I think I'm firmly a Minnesotan. I know that sometimes we have conversations about whether you're ever truly a Minnesotan if you're not born here, but I will proclaim that I am, because I really do love it here. Excuse me. It's been a weird year to release a book because I have yet to do an in-person event. I have yet to actually physically be in the same room with other people who liked or were interested in my book. So having these events is great, and thank you for that community in the way that we're able to create that community. And I look forward to anything where we can be in person in the future. So a quick overview. The book is from the Minnesota Historical Society, and they're actually doing four of them in a series. So Duluth, they actually all look pretty similar too. So Duluth and Minneapolis came out last year. I don't have the Duluth one with me, but the cover looks, obviously there's a picture of Duluth and then it says Duluth, an urban biography. Minneapolis came out last year. St. Paul is coming out in just a few months. So keep an eye out for that. I did not write that one, but a friend of mine did, and I'm looking forward to reading it as well. And there's supposed to be a Rochester book, and I don't know if that's coming out this year or not, but keep an eye out for that as well. And the idea is to have the 4 largest cities in Minnesota have these histories in a set, really, by the Historical Society. So I'm going to talk about it for a little bit. Feel free, as Seth mentioned, to add comments and questions in the Q&A, and I look forward to the questions part of these presentations more. So I really look forward to hearing from you. So the goal of this book, excuse me, was to try to tell the story of how Minneapolis became Minneapolis in a way that also tries to explain how we ended up with such glaring and gaping inequities and disparities. And so a lot of the book is chronological, but not all of it. It's really more thematic. And it really does so with a through line to say this stuff happened, and that helps inform why those disparities exist. Even as this city, as Seth noted in the snippet he read, we make a legitimate argument for a must see kind of place or a must live kind of place, but let's also find out and explore why these other things are happening. I also want to note that this book actually went to press after the COVID pandemic started, but a couple of weeks before George Floyd was killed. So this book has no reference. It makes one passing reference to the pandemic, which we were able to sneak in at the end of the editing process, but there's no reference to George Floyd because it was in the printer before George Floyd was killed. That will obviously be an important chapter if we ever update the book, and new epilogues and things like that. But there's a belief that events, I think, have to settle a bit before we can get a sense of where they'll land in the history of a place. But I don't think I'm being too hasty in saying that George Floyd will and must be a critical part of the Minneapolis story forever, really. So Seth did a little reading. I'm actually going to read just a little bit more from that prologue when he was talking about the whiplash. Um, uh, so just a slight more reading from what Seth. I'm actually going to pick up from where Seth left off because we're talking about that whiplash. The whiplash was baked into Minneapolis since before its founding in 1867. No state seemed more behind preserving the Union and ending slavery in 1860 when Minnesotans cast the second highest percentage of votes for Abraham Lincoln than voters in any other state. It was the first state to send volunteer soldiers to the Union effort when the Civil War started. Then a year later, Minnesota's concentration camp was built, followed by the expulsion of all the Dakota and Ho-Chunk people. In 1909, with slavery abolished and Minneapolis on the right side of history, a race riot started by white people in Prospect Park signaled the beginning of a new generation of real estate contracts that kept people of color from buying homes. Minneapolis exists where it does because of St. Anthony Falls. The falls, which are cloaked in a concrete apron, fueled industries that separated this city from any other between Chicago and Seattle. The timber and flower industries provided markets and jobs for farmers, lumberjacks, and laborers throughout the upper Midwest. The Minneapolis whiplash exists here, where the Pillsburys and Washburns made their fortunes and built corporate industrial giants that created offshoot markets for their prosthetic limb businesses because so many people lost body parts on the job. A mile downriver, the immigrants who lived in the flood-prone Bohemian flats fed themselves in part by snagging floating fruit discarded upstream. Even the river is part of the whiplash. It was a crucial part of the city's growth and success until it wasn't, so we turned our backs on the river until we didn't. So that's just a little bit more of an excerpt from the book. So it when this book came out, it really sadly seemed that Minneapolis was the center of the world. The killing of George Floyd was the start of an international movement of protests against police brutality and the redeclaration that Black Lives Matter, which they do. And we are seeing just tomorrow now this trial for the officer who is the first officer who's accused of killing George Floyd starts. And I think Minneapolis is going to be in the center of the world now again for a while. But it's important when we talk about the center of the world to note that Minneapolis, before it was Minneapolis, actually was and is the actual center of the world to the Dakota people who lived here for millennia before any white people showed up. The confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers is sacred. It's the actual place where the creator started everything, according to many Dakota people. The Dakota peoples have many creation stories, but Bedote is a key one, especially in our region. We know, excuse me, we know that confluence as a spot where Fort Snelling is and where Pike Island is. Maybe you've hiked on Pike Island, maybe you've gone skiing there. But it's been known as Bedote much longer, and it's not an exaggeration, it really isn't, to compare how sacred Bedote is to Dakota people as Jerusalem is to Jews, Muslims, and Christians. So this moment when Minneapolis, I feel like this week is again at the center of the world, is one that implores, especially white Americans, to reconcile with the fact that this is a country built on stolen land, and in a way that benefited and still benefits white people. And I do wonder if we'll be able to recenter the Dakota people here in their sacred place of creation. So, as we tell the history of what became Minneapolis, the first time you had a representative of the young United States was when um, a guy named Zebulon Pike showed up and tried to get indigenous people to sign over their land. So we have this thing in 1805 called Pike's Treaty or Pike's Purchase. And the Dakota people ceded 100,000 acres that became the hub of the Twin Cities. So when you think of 100,000 acres, just Minneapolis and St. Paul, I think combined, I think they're roughly 75, 80,000 acres. And so if you think of 100,000 acres, it's just a little bit beyond that. That's this where we are sitting, if you're in Minneapolis or St. Paul, is a result of Pike's Treaty. But the treaty, I'm going to use air quotes, is actually largely considered invalid for many reasons I describe in the book. That did not stop the army from coming in several years later to build the fort and later to stop speculators coming in to harness the power of St. Anthony Falls for timber and flour mills. But it really is important to take a moment as we think about where we live and we think about the fact that native lands were stolen across what is now the United States. And in here, they tried to do it through a legal mechanism called a treaty. And even here, for Minneapolis and St. Paul, where we sit here today, the initial treaty is largely, even by officialdom in the Congress, there's actually arguments that Congress said this wasn't a valid treaty, that we actually started all of this with what is a very invalid treaty. So food for thought on a Sunday morning. As the Minneapolis we know today started being built up, all the power to make decisions rested in a select few white settler colonists who had come here to make money first off the timber business and then the flour. So it's really hard to know, even if you've been to the Boundary Waters, even if you've been to these parts of northern Minnesota where the forests seem so thick, it's really hard to actually comprehend how thick Minnesota was with trees. The falls created the water power sufficient to power mills that processed all those felled trees. And then later, the water powered mills, and the water came in and turned big grinders that were turned by the force of the water coming through. And those grinders broke down wheat into flour, and that was the start of what became General Mills and Pillsbury. So if you don't know this little historical tidbit, St. Paul became a city almost a decade before Minneapolis did. But in those intervening years, when St. Paul was a city, Minneapolis was not, there was a huge financial panic in 1857, pretty much a mini depression. And it really broke St. Paul. So many businesses failed in St. Paul at the time. And frankly, Minneapolis didn't have as much to lose at the time because it wasn't a full-fledged city. So when St. Paul had to rebuild, there was a little bit more compromise between the businesses and workers and city leaders. They were kind of doing this, we're all in this together thing. And one of the ways this manifests is that St. Paul soon became a union town, where Minneapolis very much was not. It's also worth noting for my audience here today, 1857 is the year that 18 people got together and formed Plymouth Congregational Church. But think about that for a second. What if that church had been founded 10 years earlier in St. Paul and then the panic came? Or even if it was in Minneapolis 10 years earlier? The main part of the panic happened just a few months after this church was founded. So did that stunt the growth of the church? I actually don't know the answer to that. I'm just throwing it out there. And what did these 18 people, and hopefully more by the time the church was founded, do during that panic to serve the community? I don't know the answer to that, but that would be an interesting thing to think about and research and look through your archives for, because this church was founded in the middle of a really hard time economically for the people in the country. So it would be interesting to know what those early moments were like in this church's history because you have such a strong history of service to the community. So just another food for thought on a Sunday morning. The timber, as I mentioned earlier, St. Paul had become a union town and Minneapolis was not. It's the timber and flour barons had such a grip of control that they really quashed nearly all efforts by workers to do anything collectively. So for the first half of the 20th century, Minneapolis was not a union town. But this was also a pretty progressive area as well. Black men gained the right to vote in Minnesota 2 years before the Constitution was amended to give that franchise to all Black men. So before it was a national allowance that Black men could vote, Minnesota was ahead of the game. On paper, we had a strong history in the post-Civil War era of passing anti-discrimination legislation. In fact, the year Minnesota became a state, 1858, as you know, the families who founded Plymouth also fired their first minister for not taking a strong enough stand against slavery. So on paper, we had strong progressive credentials. On paper, it was illegal to deny a Black man a room at a hotel or a public place like a restaurant. But in practice, it was much different. And when we think back last summer to George Floyd's memorial in Minneapolis, Reverend Al Sharpton was one of the speakers, and he used the imagery of the police officer kneeling on George Floyd's neck and noting that Sharpton then used that imagery to note that Black America has tried to get ahead, tried to do this and that throughout history, and your knee was on our necks the whole time. And that is true in Minneapolis. We are not off the hook at all here in the North. It is true we did not have Jim Crow laws like they had in the South, where you had separate fountains and buses and bus stations and bathrooms and things like that. But we still do put our knees on people's necks in other ways. So I'm going to read one quote. This is from Dick Gregory. If any of you remember him, comedian, satirist, really came to prominence in the 1960s. And he said this. This is one of his quotes. For a Black man, this was actually, by the way, from one of his shows. So this is actually Dick Gregory doing a bit. He's trying to get a rise out of people, and satire, as you know, is rooted in truth. And so this is a joke, but listen to it for a second. For a Black man, there is no difference between the North and the South. In the South, they don't mind how close I get as long as I don't get too big. In the North, they don't mind how big I get as long as I don't get too close. And that is actually quite literally true here in Minneapolis for what is then another chapter of this city's history. And that is a history that has really come to light in the last decade because of an organization called Mapping Prejudice, which I'll come back to in a moment. But it's the history of racial covenants. I think a lot of people who have ever wandered down and done some history and thought about this and that probably know about the concept of redlining, which actually gets its start from federally guaranteed housing loans. And they would draw red lines around neighborhoods where they weren't going to guarantee those loans. And banks just basically abided by all of those maps. And so if you lived within those red lines, you couldn't get a loan guaranteed. And so you had to do other mechanisms for buying a house. And it was just harder to buy a house. And redlining is a thing. Racial covenants are a cousin of that, but technically different. Racial covenants are written into the deeds of houses. And so if Seth Patterson is going to sell me his house, his contract, the contract that we sign for me to buy his house says, all right, Tom, it's all right for you to buy this house. Good luck. But when it comes time for you to sell the house, Tom, you are not allowed to sell it to any Black people, or actually there was a whole list of people I couldn't sell it to. In the early days, Jews were included, but that was actually struck down within a few years for religious rights reasons. But because these were private contracts between two parties, because this wasn't officially the government saying Black people can't buy houses, which was struck down by the court, this mechanism wasn't struck down, frankly, until decades later. And even when it became illegal to have racial covenants writ large, the damage had already been done. And so even the suburbs, had covenants. And so you think about, why are the suburbs, at least in their early history, so predominantly white? Not a mistake, not an accident. Because when people came in to build subdivisions in a new town that's just springing up from the fields, they literally said, we're going to build a subdivision here, and everyone who buys it has to sign a contract that has these racial covenants in it. I also want to say, and I'm just noting here, we have about 45 people on this call today, on this webinar. I guarantee you, someone watching doesn't know it, but someone watching who owns a house in the Twin Cities has this language still to this day on their property records. As a side note, there's actually an effort underway because of a law that was passed a few years ago. It's actually now pretty easy to get rid of those covenants. But there's actually an effort called Just Deeds, JUSTDEED, DEED, deeds, like a property deed, just deeds, where many cities are joining this effort to actively reach out to homeowners and say, you have this language on your property records, do you want to get rid of it? So I would look that up just as something for you to do on a Sunday. The census is also something, and I'm going to wrap up here in a few minutes here and take your questions. But the most amazing statistic I found when I was researching this book is that when Minneapolis hit its highest ever population, it was in 1950. In 1950, Minneapolis had more than 500,000 people, 521,000 people. And at that time, and we're about 485 now, 98.4% white. At the moment Minneapolis had its highest ever population, 500,000 people, it was 98.4% white. Minneapolis and St. Paul's Black populations only surpassed 2% in 1960, and as late as 1980, Minneapolis was still 87.3% white. And I'll be fascinated to know it's about 2/3 white now today. So we're definitely more diverse than we used to be racially, but we come from a history of being basically a 98, 99% white community. So again, this book, the hope of the book, and I've left out a lot of individual stories, and maybe we'll get to some in the questions here, but we're just trying to remind you that Minneapolis is not just great parks and a good beer scene. It's a place with deep histories of discrimination, even if that discrimination came in the form of Minnesota nice passive aggressiveness. And one of my hopes of this book is that it kills the idea that Minnesota nice is a fun thing to joke about. It really isn't. It's really how we have maneuvered in a world, frankly, of white supremacy. And so to write a book that says, here's the story of Minneapolis and how it contributes to the systemic racism that's always been here, when I do that, it's really only going to be a surprise to white people. Black and brown people might not know every single story or event that's listed in this book, but they've lived this their whole lives. And so that's something to just keep in mind as well. And I just want to thank you all for giving me a chance to speak, and I appreciate any support. Again, it's been a weird year. I have no feedback. Seth saying he liked the book is one of the few pieces of feedback I've ever actually gotten about the book, because we haven't been able to do events. And so thank you so much. And just one final shout out before we go to questions. I would hope you'll support the Historical Society. They're not asking me to say this, but I hope you will. As you know, they have a lot of museums and historic sites that were closed the last year. So just something to consider, if for no other reason than they have a huge archive of this state's history. There's more, actually, if you've ever been to the Minnesota Historical Society or the History Center in St. Paul, there's actually more of that building that's underground than above ground because of all the archives they have. And so I hope you'll support and be along with the idea that that's something we have to save as well. So anyway, Seth, if you want to jump back on, I think I see a couple questions coming in, but I want to make sure people have a chance to ask some questions too.
Thank you, Tom. Again, you rolled very quickly through an in-depth book, which is necessary in this time. And you're right, the questions often illuminate what's most appealing and interesting to people in this. So thank you very much for that. And again, I highly recommend this book, because even if you don't live in Minneapolis, your churches in Minneapolis, and your church has never been anywhere else but Minneapolis. And as Tom reminded us, we are rooted in the fabric of the city in a way that cannot be forgotten, and gives us a different responsibility potentially in how we currently live in the city, even if you as a person may live elsewhere. And thank you, Mary, for mentioning that you were able to take the covenant off of your house in Golden Valley.
That's great.
That you're the first person I know who's done that.
Yeah.
I know people who have talked about it, but that's thank you for sharing that. And I put the website for the Mapping Prejudice in the chat, so if you would like to look at it and find out maybe where you live, what its history is. All right, so questions are coming in, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get into them. Nelson Berg asks, how did you come to write this book? And what is, he says, future projects? Like, what's next for you? What's coming up?
Well, thank you. I came to it. This was actually the Historical Society asking me. Oftentimes, writers will maybe spend some time researching, and they'll come up with the outlines of a book, and they'll make a pitch. They'll say, hey, I have an idea for a book. Publisher, hey, publisher, you want to write my book? Here's what it's about. And here's 3 to 5 pages about something. And maybe you have a snippet of what you've already written. That's actually not what happened here. They said, we're doing this series. We know we're going to do these 4 books. Will you do the Minneapolis book? And the woman who was my editor is a woman named Ann Regan. She and I had actually been talking for several years while I was in my public radio world about one day maybe writing a book. And when I left NPR, this actually became a natural progression. As far as future projects, I'm actually in a room where I'm looking right over there at the corner of my room, and I have a box that's just stuffed, and it's just it's not at all in any order. There's stuff with newspaper clippings, and I have some thoughts, but I'm not really sure yet. So yes, I have other thoughts in mind, but nothing is like going, and I haven't really done enough work on it to feel comfortable saying that this might be a thing, because I would be disappointed if then it wasn't. I did actually write a book a few years ago, which has nothing to do with history. It's a little travel book, and I'm looking around to see if I have it here. It's called 100 Things to Do in the Twin Cities Before You Die. And it's just kind of a bucket list book. It's just kind of a fun thing. And I only mention that because it's possible that the next project may actually be updating that book in the next year or so. Just a fun thing to have if you're looking for something to do. But that's not at all, the heft of what I did here with Minneapolis.
Thank you. And I was wondering if you were going to turn your camera around and show us that box.
I am not,
stuffed
because I am like everyone else who has something presentable on screen, but then everything else in the room is not something I want to show you.
That's so true. All right. So Jackie asks, did you come across material about Southern slave owners who came to Minnesota in the summers with their slaves and invested in land around the Twin Cities and other areas of the state?
Yes. And the first iteration of that is that they came up because it wasn't as hot, right? Like, just think of it. In the summer, in the South, they were oppressively hot, down there. They came up here to just have tourism. So the first iteration,
like reverse snowbirds,
basically, and it was that. So what you had here, and this goes back to my earlier point, is that on paper, we had all these laws on the books that said you can't discriminate, and that were actually progressive on race issues. But we were a small, young city. And remember, St. Anthony was its own city initially. St. Anthony existed before Minneapolis existed, and then later Minneapolis merged with St. Anthony, and the name of St. Anthony went away except as a neighborhood. So St. Anthony existed first, and it was fledgling. We needed the money. One of the ways that two ways Minneapolis was able to grow early on was Southern slave owners came with their slaves and spent money here to have a vacation. So you have all these laws on the books that say you can't be discriminatory, yet you have all these Southern enslavers who don't know that way of life and aren't excited to give you my business if you push the issue very much. So it ended up being not even just the hotels where these people would stay. It would be all of the businesses that supported people who came up turned a blind eye. They just said, okay. Now that's not entirely true. There's actually the story of Eliza Winston, who I would recommend, who's in the book, but I recommend you look it up. And Bill Green, who is a former Minneapolis superintendent who teaches at Augsburg now, wrote a great article about Eliza Winston for Minnesota History, a magazine that comes out from the Historical
Bill
Society.
Green did a forum just like you are 2 years ago, and
Wonderful.
bulk of it was this story. That's
The Eliza Winston story. Yeah, so the Eliza Winston story, Bill's the expert on that. So one of the ways, you're a growing city, you're young, you're established. One of the ways you make money is tourism revenue. And part of that tourism is enslavers from the South who also bring their enslaved people up. And we just have to figure out a way around it. And we do the Minnesota thing of like turning the blind eye. And the other way we made revenue enough to survive was when some of those initial treaties were made where indigenous people um, um, uh, officially on paper gave up their land, but there's a whole thing there, but they ceded the land. They were promised payments. And when some of those payments did come in, that was the cash that fueled the growth of the city. If you want to call that blood money, you can, but it's to say that there's this trading going on and there is this federal money coming in, this government money that is going ostensibly to indigenous people, but then they're spending their money in trade. And maybe that's out in greater Minnesota where farmers then bring their goods to Minneapolis. It all fueled itself. You know, the idea that any of these barons got their start because they pulled themselves up by the bootstraps and did it all by themselves is ridiculous. The idea of we talked today about, you know, government spending and things like that. It's been happening for centuries, and who has been benefiting from it is a fair question to ask. So yes, that absolutely happened. And the land speculation was a second iteration of that, but the first iteration was just tourism, just flat out tourism.
It's interesting to think about that reverse snowbird history where we were impacted by people escaping the heat in the same way that the story of other places might be told by us collectively escaping the cold. John asks, do you have or know of any stories of white flight during the 50s and 60s? And how were the flames of fear fanned? Developers, media, others, like what were the ways in which that was pushed?
Well, I mean, yes, white flight absolutely happened. We just see it. We see it happening on the maps. But I think what was happening was two things. There was a legit baby boom right after World War II, and if you lived in a small house in Minneapolis and suddenly you have 4 or 5 kids, which was way more the norm back then than it is today, and then you hear about someone out in a place like Edina or Minnetonka, or I'm in the west suburbs here. So you hear about all these communities out here where you literally have more land and you can build a bigger house for less money. I mean, that's not rooted in racism per se when it says come have a bigger house for about the same money or less money, right? That part is fine. But what then happens is when that starts to happen, who can get a loan? Think about who can actually secure a loan for the house. It ends up being because of a lot of policies and bank practices that white people are the only people who can get the loans, which actually in that regard is okay because white people are the only people who could buy the houses too. So the white flight came from, yes, the idyllic view of I just need a bigger place to live, we're having more kids. That existed, but it would be ridiculous to think that only white families were the ones that wanted to get a bigger house where they could have more room and do more things. I think it would be fair to say most people wanted that. The question then became in step 2, who was able to actually get the loan? Who was actually able to buy the house? And all of that. So it's kind of a 2-step tango that you have to think about. It was the reasons for white flight were probably universal. Then it comes to the actual doing the work and who actually gets to do things like secure those loans.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left, Tom, and we have
Okay.
7 questions. So however we can try to get through this.
Great,
All
let's
right,
do it.
so Tom asks, do you have any comments on the relationship between the union movement and the local people of color? You sort of touched on this in that St. Paul, Minneapolis separation and change. Comment more?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, because there are people, first of all, just a few people you should know about. Lena Olive Smith is a name you should know, because she was a union organizer, I think initially for hotel workers, but she became the first woman in Minnesota to ever be licensed as an attorney, black woman, I'm sorry, the first black woman ever to be licensed as attorney. And she also did a lot of union work. And then in 1945, on the same day that Hubert Humphrey was elected mayor, she was elected to the Minneapolis Library Board, which used to be a thing and used to be an elected post. And she was the first Black person ever elected to citywide office. So the history of that includes names of people who were part of the union movement. But you have to think about who was in the unions. I'm sorry, I take that back. You have to think about who were the workers who were interested in forming unions. And when you think about the flour mills, for example, it was a large immigrant population. And so the initial, there was a lot of the initial efforts to unionize in Minneapolis. Again, remember in St. Paul, it was much easier. Basically, everyone was in a union in St. Paul if you worked in St. Paul. And in Minneapolis, they had union busting tactics underway, including an organization called the Citizens Alliance, which I get into in the book, but was basically an anti-union business that all of its membership was all of the businesses in the city who paid into this organization to fight all of these union efforts and things like that. And so people of color were absolutely a part of that. And it's important to remember that this was also immigrants. And it's really not any different than we're seeing today with, for example, the healthcare workers that you see that are trying to unionize. You see Amazon workers all over the country trying to unionize. And I think you see a lot of people of color and immigrants who are part of those efforts. And so that has never, frankly, never really gone away in terms of who it is. Because you have to think about who it is who would want a union, who it is that would want to collectively bargain. And, we have in the history of Minneapolis a huge swath of the Scandinavian immigrants that Minnesota becomes known for now, right? And they present as white, so we just assume that that's white people who are unionizing, and they are, but they also are immigrants, and that's an important part of it as well. And so the idea that immigrants, which also includes people of color, and then in the case after the Civil War of former enslaved people, they're the people who are doing the blue collar work.
Nelson asks, please comment on what you learned of the roots of the gaps in education achievement. So pulling it more towards today,
Right.
but it has its roots in all that you're talking about.
Well, it's just like, it goes back to that stat I mentioned earlier. In 1950, think about 1950. We just finished World War II. We have a boom in population. One of the first crises Hubert Humphrey, as mayor of Minneapolis, faces and campaigns about is a housing shortage, because you have all these veterans coming back, starting families. We don't have enough room. There were Quonset huts in North Minneapolis being built just as temporary housing for people. You think we have a housing problem today, and we do, but post-war. So you think about Minneapolis as a place that needs all of these houses, therefore all of these schools, right? Think about, in a place that's 98.4% white, who are those schools going to be built for? When we think about the education model, build a school, have students come, do an hour for English, do an hour for math, do an hour for reading, or maybe in the earlier grades, it's longer sets, but then you do a separate thing on this. Think about how the school day is set up. Who established that? Who made that up, right? You think about culturally competent education and where people excel and where they don't. That was never in the blueprints when they were creating schools. Now, obviously, schools were here before 1950. They go back to the 1800s. But it was the same situation where it was a nearly 99%. So it wasn't that they were, actively saying you can't come here. In fact, there was actually a big case in St. Paul about a school that was built just for Black students, and that didn't actually play out as much in Minneapolis as far as segregation went, except it was pro forma segregation, right? Because we were a 99% white community anyway. And so it's from the roots. It's from the ground up that it was built it was built by white people for white people. And then you ask 100 years later, why are the students who aren't white performing differently and not as well and achieving less um, in school? Well, who is the school built for?
Richard asks, and of course, this is just your opinion. I don't believe you have single-handedly the power to make this happen, but it is an interesting question. Should reparations begin with Pike's Treaty for the Dakota people?
This is the question, and I've talked to Native people who are descendants of the Dakota chiefs who were here at the time, and they say, until you give us the land back, I have nothing to talk to you about. So you think about Pike's Treaty, what would be the purest form of reparations for Pike Treaty? Well, it would probably be to give back the 100,000 acres. Well, guess what? That's Minneapolis and St. Paul. So what do you do? Right? Like I get this is complex. And frankly, I think that any of these conversations starts with asking and engaging with Dakota people and Native people about what they would like to see. I think you're going to find, this is just what I think is out there, you're going to find that they get that you're not going to get every acre of land back. But what about Pikes Island? That's part of a state park. Why not start there? Things like that. What are the things we can do now to start down that road? You know, Plymouth Church, how much land do you own? I don't know. Like, what if there was engagement with the Native community to say, what can we do? What can we do? I know
It's
you're not going to
interesting.
give. I know
It's
you're not
interesting
going
you say that, because that's next week's forum. Not
to. Oh, okay.
specifically, but
Right.
a little bit about that.
So I think the thing about, and again, I know you were asking my opinion, but it can't just be me thinking about it. It has to be engagement with, because if we came up with this big idea for reparations on what that would look like in a 21st century society, but we never actually talked to the people who were affected by these policies and who frankly would be the recipients of reparations in whatever form they take, then we haven't done our work. This has to be a whole community conversation, and so that's where you start. You start with those conversations.
So about 5 minutes, and we have 5 questions. So
okay,
unfortunately, I don't think we'll get through all of them.
Okay.
Please talk about the reaction of non-church associated residents of Minneapolis to Lutheran and Catholic social services support of Hmong and Somali immigrant settlement here.
That's actually what I'm not as familiar with. It's the usual run of refugees look different and what's going on here. But there is this wonderful history. Like we have this history of being a place that settles and resettles refugees, thanks to the organizations, to Lutheran Social Services and others. We actually have this amazing reputation, and we have done really great work. And I kind of lost my train of thought there at the end of it, but then you have to think about people are then living here, building community, and you think about in the 80s, for example, when we had 4 decades of population decline and we finally started to turn it around. Why is that? Is it because Lake Street had a bunch of immigrant-owned businesses that were popping up and a bunch of new people being located in there? I think so. I think you can make the case in the 80s and 90s that immigrants saved Minneapolis. And that's something to think about as well. It doesn't answer your question, but it's part of the mix.
Ryan asks, in your book, you speak briefly about the construction of 35W that went through a minority neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And we don't hear about that much, generally speaking. We hear about Rondo and I-94. Was it a similar impact?
Yeah.
And Brian, also, Hennepin History Museum either just did or is about to do something on this. You can look at their website.
That's great. I think you're right. I can't remember if it's happening now or yet, but it is so interesting that, especially in the decade since it happened. I mean, the example of Rondo on I-94 is a horrible, horrible page in our history, and we should absolutely focus on it. We absolutely should tell that story, and we cannot forget that the same kind of thing was happening in Minneapolis when 35W was built. I remember moving here in more than a decade ago, talking to people who I didn't know anybody here. I knew maybe 3 people here. I said, "Where should I live? I'm coming up." I remember coming up to look for an apartment. Where should I live? And I absolutely remember someone saying to me, "Well, here's a map of Minneapolis. All of this to the west of 35W, yeah, you'll do fine. East of 35W, maybe not." Absolutely happened to me. Absolutely a true story in my life of what somebody said. And guess what? I lived west of 35W. I'm like, okay, I don't know anything. So I took that person's advice. So it's absolutely a thing. The divide didn't create that split, it exacerbated it. And that's important. So I'm glad that more people are talking about that as well.
Beth asks, what is the best way to purchase this book that would benefit the most people? And I imagine she means from where? And yeah.
All your local bookstores are have this or can get it. Bookstores in the last year had to reinvent themselves, so everybody can get the book to you. And if you order it online, they do curbside. There is some in person now at bookstores. You can do curbside, you can do delivery, mail delivery. Excuse me. So whatever your favorite local bookstore is, if they don't have it, they can get it. So just support your favorite local bookstore. That would be my answer.
Yeah, I always look at Majors and Quinn and Moon Palace and Birch Bark before I ever look anywhere else. And I think that's where I got yours specifically. So thank you, Tom. Know that if we were in person, which we all wish we could be, this would be where people would stand up and cheer and applause that we would have to stop eventually.
Sure.
So we really appreciate you, your thoughtfulness and your time and your generosity around this.
Thank you so much. Tom. And if you ever can social media about it or give me a rating on some of the websites, I would be appreciative too. It helps get the word out. Thank you.
Yeah. And then a few reminders. One, I'd like to thank the Forum Committee. They are members of Plymouth who work very hard to make sure that every week we have compelling and interesting and thoughtful people to be in dialogue with us. So thank you to that committee. You do great work. There is, like I said earlier, there is a class on this book where we will dive in deeper. It's a 5-week class throughout April and into the beginning of May. And Jim Bear Jacobs, the Director of Racial Justice at the Minnesota Council of Churches, will be joining me. And then Tom Weber will join us for the last week to help wrap things up and have the expert in the room for whatever questions that Jim Bear and I can't quite get to. As I alluded to earlier, next week's forum is talking about, so today we talk about Minneapolis. Next week, we're talking about Plymouth. Plymouth has some substantial wealth in both land and resources in this city. We own a whole square city block. We have other peripheral materials, and 2 of our deacons, Brian Siska and Jeff Hall, are beginning the exploration to what does that mean? How does our history and our rootedness and our ownership of pieces of this land reflect into where we want to go as a community into the future? So please join us next week at the same time with Brian Siska and Jeff Hall, 2 of our wonderful deacons. Thank you all. Sign up for the class, buy the book, go out and be well. Have a wonderful, wonderful, warm March day. Take care. Thank you, Alex.